Hey everybody, Professor Moore here, and I have a question for you. Have you ever heard of the Sand Creek Massacre? Because I hadn't until a few years ago when I read Dee Brown's classic book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. But the Sand Creek Massacre was never talked about in any class that I ever took, in middle school, high school, college, graduate school, but it should have been. When I was in high school, we were taught that the only bad thing that ever happened to Native Americans was the Trail of Tears. This was the forced removal of thousands of indigenous people from their land from the 1830s to the 1850s, which led to horrifying atrocities, such as in 1838 when over 4,000 Cherokee men, women, and children died on a brutal death march to a desolate reservation, which was really nothing more than a concentration camp. However, the Trail of Tears was presented to us as an isolated tragedy and not part of a wider strategy of ethnic cleansing and genocide that started in 1492 and still impacts the world we live in today. The Trail of Tears is just one chapter in this long history of violence that was aimed at land dispossession and the extermination of America's indigenous population. The Sand Creek Massacre is another one of those dark chapters, and it proves that extreme violence against Native Americans was not the exception, but the rule. Extreme violence and atrocities were not isolated incidents, but key components of how the United States was made. After learning more about indigenous history, I realized that no telling of American history is complete without acknowledging this violence. American history is not true history if we leave out the Sand Creek Massacre. So here's what happened. In the early 1860s, as more and more American settlers continued to pour into native land in Colorado, some members of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes resisted this invasion, and because of that resistance, they were targeted and attacked by the U.S. military. One Cheyenne leader called Black Kettle negotiated a peace deal that led to hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho people being incarcerated on a U.S. military reservation called Sand Creek. They camped under a white flag of truce, and they had federal permission to hunt buffalo to feed themselves. Despite their compliance with the government's orders, on November 29, 1864, Colonel John M. Shivington of the U.S. Army took 700 Colorado volunteers and they went to the Sand Creek Reservation. Without provocation or warning, they attacked the indigenous people there, killing between 150 and 230 people, mostly women and children. However, they not only killed these people, they mutilated their bodies and desecrated their corpses. Robert Bent was one of the men at the scene of the crime, and here's what he described. There seemed to be indiscriminate slaughter of men, women, and children. There were some 30 women collected in a hole for protection. They sent out a little girl about 6 years old with the white flag on a stick. She had not proceeded but a few steps when she was shot and killed. All the women in that hole were afterwards killed. I saw one woman cut open with an unborn child laying by her side. I saw the body of White Antelope with the privates cut off. And I heard a soldier say he was going to make a tobacco pouch out of them. I saw one woman whose privates had been cut out. I saw a little girl about 5 years of age who had hid in the sand. 2 soldiers discovered her, drew their pistols and shot her, and then pulled her out of the sand by the arm. I saw quite a number of infants in arms killed with their mothers. Lieutenant James Connor of the U.S. Army arrived the next day, and here's what he found. In going over the battlefield the next day, I did not see a body of a man, woman, or child that was not scalped. And in many instances, their bodies were mutilated in the most horrible manner. Men, women, and children's privates cut out. I heard one man say that he had cut out a woman's private parts and had them for exhibition on a stick. I also heard of numerous instances in which men had cut out the private parts of females and stretched them over their saddle bows and wore them over their hats while riding in the ranks. I heard another man say that he had cut the fingers off an Indian to get the rings on his hand. According to the best of my knowledge and belief, these atrocities were committed with the knowledge of Shivington. After the massacre, Shivington and his men burned down teepees and stole horses. And when they got back to Denver, they displayed the body parts they had cut off their victims in the Apollo Theater and several saloons. They treated these pieces of human beings as trophies, and they paraded them around for the public to see and celebrate. The Federal Commissioner for Indian Affairs condemned this massacre and said that these people had been butchered in cold blood by troops in the service of the United States. However, despite a detailed report of the massacre, neither Shivington nor any of his men were reprimanded or prosecuted, sending the signal that it was not a crime to kill Native Americans. It was approved and encouraged. In his study of the massacre, D. Brown concluded, "Thus did the Cheyennes and Arapahoes abandon all claims to the territory of Colorado." And that, of course, was the real meaning of the massacre at Sand Creek. Massacres like the one that happened at Sand Creek had one goal: terrorism. The goal was to terrorize Native Americans so that they would leave and their land could be stolen. Like so many stories of American white supremacist violence, the Sand Creek Massacre has only recently begun to get the recognition it deserves. It was only 10 years ago that the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site opened up in Colorado, and it's significant to note that this is the only site in the National Park Service that has massacre in its name. It was only 4 years ago when Colorado decided to commemorate the Sand Creek Massacre with a statue in their Capitol building in Denver. In 2020, protesters tore down a statue of a Union soldier that used to have a plaque celebrating what happened at Sand Creek, calling it a battle and not a massacre. After that statue was torn down, Colorado politicians decided to replace it with a statue of a Native American woman mourning the lives that were lost that day in 1864. Even though statues like this can never bring back the people that were lost, it is a step in the right direction, because for so long this history has been completely erased. The Sand Creek Massacre has been discarded from the broader narrative of American history, because once you start to acknowledge this violence, it becomes impossible to ever buy into the feel-good myth that this country was founded as a shining city on a hill that was meant to be a moral example for the rest of the world. There were certainly those who saw the Sand Creek Massacre as a moral example to follow, including a certain German politician with a funny mustache who in 1928 praised the United States for how it had gunned down the millions of Redskins to a few 100,000. It's episodes like the Sand Creek Massacre that reveal the true face of American exceptionalism. America was and is exceptionally violent. And no one knows this truth more than Indigenous people. This is what a Cheyenne leader called Roman Nose tried to explain to a U.S. Army general after the Sand Creek Massacre in 1866. When General Winfield Scott Hancock asked Roman Nose why a group of Cheyenne women and children had run away when they saw U.S. soldiers, here's what he said: "The Cheyenne warriors are not afraid, but have you never heard of Sand Creek? Your soldiers look just like those who butchered the women and children there." You know what's so sad? That question still stands true today. Have you never heard of Sand Creek? And many people still haven't, because in this country, we've tried to intentionally forget and erase our violent past. That's why I find it so ironic that a few days ago, Kamala Harris gave a speech and said Americans should never forget the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. Never forget October 7th. Never forget 9/11. This country has no problem never forgetting violence when it's committed by other people. But when it's American violence, the motto is forget. The motto is erase. So why don't we try something different? Why don't we try never forget November 29th, 1864? Why don't we start with never forget the Sand Creek Massacre? Because this is American history. This is America.